What I want to talk about is some research that I've been doing over the last few years. I've been studying digital platform-based freelancing in Asia and in Africa. And what I've been trying to do with the team that I work with is trying to understand who benefits most and least from the fact that millions of people in Africa and in Asia are now doing work that's outsourced through digital platforms. I'm a social scientist, a geographer by training, one that studies the internet, and the work. Let me tell you about where all this data came from. So what we did was we interviewed over 200 workers in Africa and Southeast Asia. We did a survey with over 500 more, and then we also analyzed some data that we got from the platforms themselves. Now, to give you some context of the scale of what I'm talking about, there are about 70 million people worldwide signed up to find works on these digital platforms or apps, 70. What are the drivers of this rapid migration of people to platform-based work? Well, the first one is maybe the most obvious, the rapid diffusion of the internet around the world. This year, in 2018, for the first time in human history, we have more people connected to the internet than disconnected from the internet. The second one is labor surplus. So there are huge populations of now connected, unemployed or underemployed people actively looking for jobs. Third is all of the invisible labor that's increasingly needed to grease the wheels of the contemporary economy. So the fact that the digital world relies on a lot of real digital labor. A few months ago, I went to this facility that you're looking at. It's in rural Uganda, and it employs hundreds of people to train machine learning algorithms that are used by things like driverless cars and shopping recommendation systems. And this is the biggest employer in that region. So those factors, they've brought about the current world of platform-based work. The jobs that have been created have provided opportunities to a lot of people, but what I want to do in this short talk is give you a deliberately broad survey of some of the key issues that have emerged for workers. What it's useful to do when thinking about these issues is to divide job types into three broad categories. So the first one being location-specific platforms, things like Uber driving or food delivering. In other words, work that necessarily needs to be done from somewhere. And then two types of what people called crowd work, which means work that can be done from anywhere. Think about translation or transcription or web design or graphic design or data entry. Now, oversupply, the first issue I want to talk about is oversupply of labor. It's an enormous issue on many of these platforms, and we see it be an issue in all three of those domains. This is a table of the world's largest crowd working platform. What we did on this chart was we compared the potential workforce, in other words, the number of profiles, the number of people signed up to successful workers. So in other words, people who worked at least 1 hour or billed at least $1. So if you look at the second from top row, the Philippines, it has 221,000 people registered looking for jobs just on this one platform, but only 32,000 managed to find any work. So in other words, what that means is just in that country alone, there are 189,000 people who are looking for jobs but can't find any work. And so because of that, a lot of workers just spend a huge amount of unpaid time looking for jobs every week. According to the survey we did, it's an average of 18 hours a week looking for jobs. The oversupply of labor and the global competition that it brings about is in part created by the geography of labor. So if we look at some data that we analyzed from the world's largest online labor platform, what we actually see is that the geography of work is quite concentrated in just a few countries. And we can see that by looking at the networks of work. In other words, what countries are the clients in and what countries are the buyers in, and how are they connected to one another. So that large yellow cord on this network that you're looking at, it goes between North America and Asia. This represents the massive flow of work from North America to Asia. But you can also see a more complicated picture. So while there are connections that dominate, there's also a planetary-wide labor market that we see here. Now this graph looks at the degree to which different regions are net exporters or net importers of labor power. The basic pattern is that the global south is a net exporter of labor, the global north a net importer. The y-axis here shows the degree to which that's the case. So the regions high on the axis indicate much more import than export of labor, power, the region's low, on the axis having much more export than import. The exception, though, is Europe, which is fairly balanced, as you can see there. So if you combine the oversupply of labor power with the spatial fragmentation of the work processes, you get a lot of stories like this one from workers who feel very powerless to negotiate conditions and rates for their labor. This starting conditions of high levels of competition in a planetary-wide labor market is the backdrop for a lot of other concerns that we noticed in our research, and I'll very quickly give you a survey of some of these. One of them is by changing how work is organized and spatially and temporally distributed, platforms can take work that was organized within the formal economy with the protections and benefits associated with that work and move it to the far less regulated informal economy. This one here probably doesn't need to be explained. It goes without saying, I think, that the platform economy or the gig economy is defined by insecurity, but going hand in hand with precarity and job insecurity is vulnerability. So people having no choice but to do work as given to them. So this is an example of a quote from our fieldwork in South Africa. Now, I asked all of the workers I spoke to if they were in a trade union, and when I asked them that, they always laughed at me, because there's an understanding that if they withdraw their labor, because of some of the reasons that I mentioned already, then workers in other parts of the world are able to quickly replace them. Now, in the locally specific platform work, there are actually some trade unions that are beginning to represent workers, but the platforms actually then usually refuse to recognize them. I think a lot of the worst issues that we see in platform labor arise because of the opacity of and the fragmentation in some of the value chains. So most clients likely have no idea what a minimum wage is or what a living wage is in the countries that they're outsourcing work to. But the opacity and the fractured labor process is also an issue for another reason. Because many workers themselves have very little idea who they're working for or what purpose their work is for. So how do you begin as a worker to push for changes in your own working conditions if you don't actually know who you're working for or even what the purpose your labor serves? So instead of offering an architecture to generate trust on the basis of thick and strong and stable and durable ties, a lot of these work platforms essentially just seek to, as you might imagine, just seek to commodify labor. And one way that they do this is through reputation systems. When you introduce these sorts of systems into a context where you already have oversupply and opacity of work, you get accumulated advantage to those who already thrive in the system. People with very good scores, they tend to get more work, way more work than they can do. And meanwhile, that I spoke to loads of workers who said it took them months or sometimes even over a year to get their first job. So this, combined with the fact that work has become a commodity easy to buy and sell, and combined with the fact that there's a rapidly growing pool of workers from low-income countries willing to work for low incomes, means that work can tend to flow through intermediaries to those willing to do it for the lowest price. So in other words, what I mean is that the very existence of a pool of connected but poor and underemployed people, it essentially just serves as a magnet for commoditized work in these value chains, irrespective of what you as a client might think you're paying someone. Let me just give you a quick example of what I mean here. This is an example of a job that a client in Sweden paid $23 for. It was just to write a search engine optimization article about suits for a Swedish company. But the person who got that job on the platform just re-outsourced it to someone willing to do it for a much lower wage until it went to the worker that we spoke with, who did it for $3.50, and was obviously found out and was obviously quite annoyed about this. But so the point is that the very existence of this large pool of connected and job-hungry workers willing to work for low wages just serves as this magnet for work in the production networks of work, irrespective of what you think you're paying them. Discrimination. So in our research, we heard cases of workers transcending local labor market discrimination, but there were equally examples of exclusion being explicitly or more subtly expressed. This is one of the more obvious ones that you see on the slide, where the client tells workers from South Asia to not even bother bidding on a certain job. And then lack of regulation. The geographically dispersed nature of a lot of platform work has led some regulators to think of digital work and digital work platforms and practices as not just unregulated, but also unregulatable. And what this means then is that there's an abundance of stories about workers who do their jobs in contravention of national labor laws. And I'll talk about this again at the end. Let me just skip through this one. So the last one I want to talk about is poor job quality, and this manifests itself in a few different ways. First, the high stress that you see in a lot of cases because of work intensity. So in other words, people having to do more than they can possibly get done. I could also talk about the social isolation, loneliness, physical, psychological impacts, low pay, and a lack of benefits. Now, I'm not saying any of all these issues that I've just raised, I'm not saying any of this to imply that these online labor platforms are actually, believe it or not, are actually inherently bad. They've undoubtedly helped a lot of people find work and income and autonomy and flexibility that they wouldn't necessarily have had otherwise. But I think that the goal here is to remember that there are some pretty important problems. And the obvious next step then is asking what are the potential ways forward? What are the potential solutions or ways of addressing some of these issues? So I think the first and most obvious one is regulation. So the geographically dispersed nature of a lot of this platform-based work has obviously made it extremely hard to regulate. The most progress has been made in the context of the locally specific work that I mentioned, where the application of national labor laws to work that's mediated through them, it's more straightforward. But remember what I showed you already about the geography of this cloud work. There's just a few countries that are home to most of the activity and most of the clients. It's those countries that have a lot of potential power to act as a regulatory bottleneck to make sure this digital work is carried out in more socially desirable ways. Collective bargaining. So if these top-down approaches aren't working, a second obvious strategy is to look to more bottom-up approaches. What can platform workers do collectively to improve working conditions? Well, I told you how workers always laughed when I asked them if they were in a trade union, but that isn't necessarily the case for everyone doing locally specific platform work. There are a lot of good examples of platform workers doing this locally specific work who are organizing with one another. But the issue is that traditional trade unions, they've always relied on proximity to build a sense of mutuality amongst workers. Place has always mattered to them. And this is going to remain a key challenge for platform workers who seek to collectively bargain or organize. So what else can we look to? Well, this is an obvious time to think about the political economy of platforms and what people are referring to as the platform cooperative movement. So workers basically owning and governing the platforms that they source work through. But here again, geography becomes a problem. There's a lot of promise for locally specific platform work, things like delivery driving or taxi driving, but where you can't outsource that job and have someone else undercut you on the other side of the planet. But for work that can actually be done from anywhere, we'd still likely find workers undercutting each other for a lot of work types. For some types of work, we can look to organizations like this one, Samasource. They do what they refer to as impact sourcing. They basically do a lot of the work that these online freelancers do, but while they do that, they ensure that a set of minimum conditions are achieved so that living wages are paid, that workers get sick leave, that they get childcare, that they get free lunches and other things like that. So essentially moving informal work back into the formal economy. But the problem is that they can really struggle to compete with the low cost base of these online platforms where clients avoid any of these costs. So the point then is that we need another strategy in addition to these. So in recognition of the planetary labor market idea and some of the issues that it brings about, I think what we probably need is a global scale or planetary scale response. So to respond to that, one of my colleagues and I are building what we're calling a Fair Work Foundation. So think of it like a fair trade foundation, but instead following the value chains, instead of following the value chains of commodities like coffee or tea or chocolate, to certify key standards relevant to the platform economy. So to certify things like this, that platforms ensure that workers are paid at least minimum wages where they live, that non-payment strictly regulated, that worker account deactivations are reviewed by a human rather than a machine, that workers can contest these things. So the point is that at the moment, these firms and platforms can use these digital technologies to jump over geographies, and in doing so, they can enroll cheap labor into their networks. They can use those same technologies to hide behind the opacity of distance that conceals any and all of these particularly problematic production practices. But what we want to do here is engage in a form of resistance over those same networks that enable this exploitation and would ideally set benchmarks and best practices that allow us to move away from the current race to the bottom that we see. So to sum all of this up, I'm not saying any of this to imply that we can go back to our pre-globalized world of work, but this doesn't necessarily mean that we should be satisfied with what's essentially a sort of parasitic capitalism where digital firms give very little back to the places that they're actually embedded in, and relatively atomized workers are left to fend for themselves. So if we end with a question about what meaningful resistance is in a planetary scale labor market, what it looks like, I think we can change our expectations. Instead of imagining digital work as being undertaken in digital spaces beyond the realm of regulation and worker-led governance, I think it's important to remember that it does happen somewhere. It has a geography, and we can use what we know about the economic geographies of this digital work to hopefully strive towards fairer futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have a number of questions to just ask you to elaborate a little bit on some of the examples you provided. So you began with a slide that, or one of your first slides was showing us a geography of work available in digital economies versus a geography of where there's a large oversupply of labor. And of course, that geography very much derives from national histories, so it doesn't come from nowhere. Can you tell us a little bit more about how platform-based labor is regulated and surveilled, given that the platform is the mechanism for that, I assume, the regulation and surveillance, yet workers are located in these different national regulatory structures? And can you also give us a sense of how national legal systems do or do not participate in regulating work or in protecting workers in any way?
Thanks. I think, well, to start with, one of the most, maybe to start with what I ended with, is it's when talking about this sort of platform-based work, a lot of people talk about it as happening on the internet or online or somehow beyond the realm of regulation, right? It happens in cyberspace rather than happening in a real place. And this comes up when we speak to both platforms and workers. So when I ask workers, one of the last questions I always ask workers was, do you pay taxes on this stuff? And almost nobody pays taxes. And some of them knew that they had to pay taxes, but just didn't want to. But some of them said things like, oh, well, you know, taxes for a real job, not for an internet job. An internet job, you don't pay taxes because it's not really, why would my national government's taxation rules apply to this thing? And then you see a lot of platform companies kind of imagining that somehow real rules in real places don't apply to them because they operate in a different space. And I think some of this imaginary comes from this early vision of what the internet was. I don't know if you're familiar with John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. It's John Perry Barlow. He with the Electronic Freedom Foundation, he wrote this really powerful and well-written and evocative Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, where I forget exactly what he says, but it's something along the lines of, you nation states have no sovereignty where we, the people of the internet, gather. We're forging a new space here. We're forging a new digital territory. And I think that vision of what the internet was, this utopian vision of what the internet was from back in the 90s and early 2000s. While that's gone away in many ways, while people growing up with the internet now don't think of it that way, I think some of that has persisted in how platforms, workers, clients all imagine the role that regulation might play in the activities that they carry out. And we see that in just the simple way that everyone's trying to avoid being regulated. The clients are, the workers are, the platforms are. It's not to say it's not changing, right? You know, we're getting a move by the EU, by certain countries to try and clamp down on activities happening through the internet or over the internet. But we're still not quite there yet, I would say.
Yeah, I was thinking when you mentioned that people regard this as not real work, so why would you pay taxes? I was thinking about Tiziana Terranova's work on free labor and the idea that this is sometimes something you do in your leisure, or you do this to supplement your other wages, and that ideology of this being not real work does something in itself. So we're all producing customer-produced data, right, which is a form of value. And so given these, and also that sort of leisure-based work, consumer-produced data as value as a kind of labor, doesn't match exactly the geography of oversupply that you showed us. So I'm interested in thinking about this other approach to thinking about digital labor, where we're all doing it in some way, together with this question of what I see as a post-colonial map of the world, where there's an oversupply of labor, and bring us back to thinking about space, since you're a geographer, and thinking about the workplace in particular, where, as you mentioned, it's historically been the place where workers meet, they see the conditions under which other workers labor, they can compare wages, right? And then they have a stage from which to organize for collective bargaining. So given this opacity for workers that a platform creates, where a worker can't see much about an employer, right? But in some ways, employers can see so much data about potential employees. Given this lack of access that workers have to their employers or any information about employers, but also it sounds like a lack of national protections, national legal protections for workers. What sort of strategies are there for workers, especially those in places with oversupply, for addressing labor conditions or even beginning to organize?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is it's difficult, right? I mean, but I think that this is one reason why in this research I try and distinguish between the locally based work and the cloud-based work, because there are very different strategies that the local platform workers have to engage in versus the cloud platform workers. It's difficult, but it's much easier for the people engaging in locally based work to engage in more traditional organizing strategies. So to have physical co-presence and to use that physical co-presence as a source of power, as a source of collective power. So in Brighton in the UK, for instance, when delivery drivers were trying to organize with one another, they had this quite smart strategy where, you know, Deliveroo is a food delivery service, a food delivery app. And so they would just keep ordering food to the place that they were all assembled, so that more drivers would come, and then they'd try and persuade those drivers to join in, and then they'd order more food until they had a critical mass of drivers organized with one another. Now, you can't do that with the cloud-based work, right? And there's this very real sense amongst all the workers that, well, if I don't do it, someone on the other side of the world if I withdraw my labor, this is pointless, because we're total competitors here in this market. So it really takes a lot of the power out of potential bottom-up approaches to the most powerful thing that workers can do, which is to withdraw their labor. Now, people are developing various ways in which workers can communicate and collaborate with one another. Like we were talking about the work of Lily Irani earlier, through the Turkopticon, but it's difficult, right? It's the idea that you can collectively withdraw your labor together with someone on the other side of the planet is unimaginable to most of these workers.
So, do we have?
Sure.
So you mentioned the work of Lily Irani and the Turkopticon project, which is an application intended to collect data from employees, right, and then provide it to other potential employees. So are there strategies like that people are engaging in, where you create a response to a platform that can be circulated digitally for workers to use while on the platform laboring, or are there other strategies? I mean, given this lack of sharing of space, right, that you say that the geographically based digital workers have, the delivery drivers, right, versus the cloud-based work. So for cloud-based work, are applications that share data the only strategy, or are there other strategies for organizing?
I imagine that, I mean, maybe I'm not being imaginative enough, but I imagine that that will be one of your key strategies, and it will simply, over time, require more and more people to develop these sorts of shadow apps. So for every platform that exists, there's a shadow platform, or a worker platform, or bottom-up platform, or whatever you want to call it, where workers can ideally communicate and connect with one another. But at the end of the day, most of these platforms are structured as markets, right, where workers underbid. The whole point of a lot of these platforms is for workers to bid against each other. And so as long as you have that kind of mechanism in place, it's going to be hard for them to not see themselves as competitors and to not act as competitors and internalize the vision that they are competitors.
But that's not so different from other forms of other labor markets, right? In some ways, that's what World Trade Organizations have allowed to happen, right? Is this global competition for lower and lower paid work. So is there a way, I mean, is a digital labor market so much different?
I think what it does differently is it puts the responsibility and the pressure on the individual, right? So instead of factories competing against each other, where this problem is the manager's problem to deal with in terms of how you set wage rates and how you have the most competitive widgets versus widgets coming out of another country. Now it's on the individual, right? So each individual has to weigh up how they value their labor. And it's much more real time as well, right? They see by the second where prices for any given tasks are going.
You mean employers? They can see by the second.
Employers and employees.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was asked, actually I think we all were asked to bring in an object that could be closely or not closely related to our topic of conversation. And so the object I brought in, which isn't so closely related but is interesting, is this book. I also have it on my slide. It's a book of copyright-free street art that was collected and edited by artists Fabiana Rodriguez and Josh McPhee in 2008. It's a large set of political graphics from all around the world that were donated by the artists, and actually the efforts were all made through the internet to collect this work. And it's accompanied by both Spanish and English text. The editors in the introduction to the book urge people to reproduce these images freely for use in their activism, political organizing, and education. I brought this book as my object, with which to begin presenting a few points from my research on racialized gender and how this impacts our discussion of borders, migration, technology, and particularly reproduction and the nation. Because the book reminds us, and the title reminds us, that part of the nation form is a history of protesting the nation and the nation form. In the Rodriguez and McPhee book, the reproduction and circulation of images is a toolkit for protest. In my research on the global outsourcing of the work of care, service, and, as I'll speak about in a bit, even childbirth, I look for and find practices that challenge national ideas of the reproduction of norms of family, the household economy, and the gendering and sexual practices that go with these. I'm going to share a few stories from my research on transnational surrogacy in India, and more generally on the relationship between technology, race, gender, post-colonialism, and outsourcing, in the spirit of the history of both repression and revolt that exists within social and biological reproduction. And as I speak, I'll be slowly clicking through some of the images from the book, but I'm not going to talk about them. They're mostly there just to give you a sense of the spirit of the book. Whom will take care of me? This question comes up for us in maybe a pressing medical emergency, such as a sudden serious injury or illness, or perhaps in a social emergency, like the loss of shelter due to a natural disaster, or simply due to the natural passing of time through health into age and infirmity. So one answer to this question, whom will take care of me, seems to be the nation-state. This imagined community that arises out of a social contract which asserts that in exchange for submitting to the power of the state, the citizen gains its protection, which includes social welfare benefits like emergency medical care, disability, medical payments when we cannot work, and retirement pensions. This seems to be an answer to that question. Another structural answer to the question, who will take care of me, who will care for me, has often been proposed as the family. The modern nuclear family as an ideal is a relatively recent invention. Here's a set of people living together in one household economic unit that's recognized by the state through things like tax reporting, medical insurance registration, school enrollment, death benefits, visitation, and custody rights, etc. Historian Nayan Shah, in his book Contagious Divides, explains how in the United States in the mid-20th century, anxieties then about immigration and racial intermixing were part of a national project to promote the nuclear, middle-class, white, heteropatriarchal household as the site of where we find the ideal citizen subject. He explains that many alternate domestic formations existed at that time, and these were pathologized to support the ideal. So the alternatives had to be pathologized in order to show that there was the ideal form. So for example, Shah looks at Chinese immigrant residences in San Francisco in the 1920s and 1930s, which included housing such as female-headed households, multifamily households, and apartments where many single migrant men would live together, among other types. These lifestyles and households were cast by a national rhetoric as a racialized threat, and in fact, even a danger to public health at that time. So the threat of the dilution of white America by immigrants was controlled by this discourse, the promotion of a discourse, and promise of a new ideal family model that was being promoted at a national level in a racist and classist measure as the American way of life. In reality, of course, most households do not match this imaginary of the nuclear family. In fact, we can look at what Shah calls these queer domesticities as protesting the reproduction of the nation because they destabilize the white nuclear heteropatriarchal family norm. Shah describes these households, their intimacies, their domesticities as non-productive in a capitalist frame, and they don't replicate the idealized citizen subject. Mixed families, single mothers raising children, perhaps in unofficial cooperatives with other single parents, grandparents housing and supporting adult children and grandchildren, the list goes on. Yet the state continues to give primary social recognition and benefits through recognizing this sanctioned legal family, this sanctioned household, constituted often through a legal union. By suggesting that what Shah calls queer domesticities refuse to produce the nation, I don't mean to simply celebrate them, as they're most often testimony to the fact that low resource contexts lead to creative living solutions, and these arise because the state refuses to recognize all but its idealized forms as worthy of rights and social welfare entitlements. So to talk a little bit about the history of this family, feminist scholars including Maria Mies, Carol Pateman, and Janet Jacobson have argued that marriage, the state's preferred way of recognizing domesticity and family, has also historically been functioned as a labor contract. Specifically, a labor contract that creates the subordinated economic position of wife within the household economic unit. Of course, women of color feminists, including Angela Davis, Evelyn Nakano-Glenn, Chela Sandoval, and many others, have pointed out that immigrant and low-resourced women have always done their own household labor, plus underpaid work in the households of wealthier, often white families. So the idea of wife as an economic unit, wife as a labor position here, is more complex than simply found in the household. And Mies, in her book, Patriarchy and the Accumulation of Capital, says that the marriage contract was what made the nuclear family possible in the first place because it created a new historical economic domestic form which allowed for the replacement of the exchange of wages for this labor that happened in the domestic realm with marriage. Mies goes on to explain that the modern marriage contract sets up a model of unpaid labor in the private sphere. So again, in the private sphere, rather than exchanging wages for labor, there's this invisibilization of those activities as work at all. And that once there's a model of unpaid labor in the private sphere, the home, this is then extended later through globalization to encompass the formerly colonized world's labor economies, the places of oversupply in Mark's talk. In other words, we can add casualized labor, including many forms of crowdsourced digital labor, sweatshop work, et cetera, to extend from this model of unpaid and underpaid labor in the gendered private sphere. So the former colonial metropole in the position of patriarch commands the gendered labor of globalized service economies who are then structurally positioned as wife in this model that Mies presents. These forms of labor have little in common except that they are deemed to be uncreative or reproductive. So we're talking about everything from sweatshop work to cloud-based labor. So the commonality is that they're understood to be low-skilled or unskilled, and therefore, while they're performed by people of any gender, the work itself is feminized. And Mies calls this process, which began in the late 1970s, housewifization, which is hard to say, but conveys her concept. So now I want to talk about one particular example of how gendered labor gets superimposed onto the formerly colonized world through what I would argue is therefore not only a gendered but also racial structure of economic exploitation in transnational surrogacy contracts in India. So surrogacy, gestational surrogacy, is basically a practice wherein a human embryo is created in a lab with human gametes, and then once it's ready, it's transplanted into the uterus of a woman who will gestate it until it's mature, until the fetus is mature, and that woman is referred to as the gestational surrogate. And I did field work with international participants, including current and former surrogates, commissioning parents, doctors, technical workers, staff, and community members at an Indian surrogacy clinic in early 2008. And at that time, the practice was still relatively new. And since that time, well, after that time, it grew into a rather large industry, which was then legally sanctioned in 2016. At that time, there were only a few clinics offering the service, and people outside of India were just starting to hear about it. I followed the development of what then grew to become something like an industry, tracking legal debates and draft law, feminist organizing and policy recommendations in India, as well as discussions in Europe and the US about the ethics of what it meant to be a commissioning parent who hires low-earning Indian women to be gestational carriers or surrogates. Surrogacy is one example of an outsourced labor market, one that follows the map of colonialism to provide the gendered and racialized support labor that reproduces citizens often of wealthier nations. So in some ways, it plugs into that system of support for the ideal citizen subject that Nayan Shah talks about growing in the US in the early 1900s. India's contemporary labor markets have been structured through ongoing patterns of how globalized Indian labor carries a history of labor allocation from its role in British imperialism. Specifically, these labor practices under the British were built into contemporary structures of trade and legal policy, which we got a sense of earlier. However, the role of technology, and here specifically reproductive technologies in commercial surrogacy, also reminds us that medicine has had a role in instrumentalizing low-earning women here in India as being reproductive bodies for other places. So at one point during my research in this clinic that I mentioned, the surrogacy clinic, I was asked to step in for an interaction between a commissioning father and a woman who wanted to be a surrogate. The doctor had to leave. I was asked to translate. The father's name is David. The surrogate's name is Pushpa. I introduced them. David was using donated eggs from an Indian donor, and his wife had chosen not to travel to India with him for this first visit. So Pushpa, the surrogate, was kind of asking him, exploring his intentions towards her and her family, and asked him if he would be willing at some point to bring her and her family to the US and help them find jobs. And this conversation for the commissioning father, David, is just about the surrogacy process, and he's nervous, he feels uncomfortable, and she's saying, can you bring us to the US, can you find us jobs? And he did sort of uncomfortably say he would like to do something to help the family someday, but he kind of evacuated from the conversation and later told me that over the course of the surrogacy, he became more and more frustrated with her continued attempts to, as he phrased it, get more money from him and his wife each time they communicated. And I found an insistence among surrogates that they felt commissioning parents should naturally feel that they owed a surrogate an extended form of support and patronage beyond what was dictated by the surrogacy contract, which was 9 months of support expense, and then a stipend at the end. And the idea was that this is more than labor. It's more than 9 months of work. It's something that exceeds the representation of money. So that was the argument from the perspective of some of the women who had been surrogates. And I think it's an important point to think about this work of care, nurture, attention, and even gestation, and how it becomes devalued because of its origination in this household economy where it's understood to be unskilled and gendered. In the study I mentioned, Nayan Shah's study of queer domesticities in 1930s San Francisco, it was meant to suggest that the work of care, of making domesticity, can lead to new social forms and can change existing institutions. So here, assisted reproductive technologies, including the practice of surrogacy, in some ways are trying to destabilize the citizen subject of the nation state and the laws that protect them. So this can go in lots of different directions that are dangerous for vulnerable subjects, like the women who are becoming surrogates. But there's also this kind of interesting aspect to that instability. The notion of family has been shifting in response to things like assisted reproduction technology to conserve outdated models of patriarchy and the nuclear family. So for example, through the legalized notion of genetic parents, where DNA indicates what is legally defensible kinship and positions the intended child as something like property under law. But can we think of the assertion of some surrogates that they should have a lasting economic connection to the families with whom they contracted for surrogacy really be understood as impossible? So I will end with rearranging my opening question, which was, who will take care of me, into a different question that I hear in this argument made by former surrogates. The question is, whom will I take care of? So the question that Pushpa, the surrogate, was asking David, the commissioning father, was, will you take care of us? And in that question, we then get an assertion of the power, perhaps, to reproduce and revolt, which again was the title of my object, Reproduce and Revolt. So again, the title of this book collection we've been viewing on the slides. Whom will I take care of is a question of building collectives within or despite the nation, and perhaps challenging the model of the autonomous individual property owner and the ideal citizen subject who reproduces the nation. And that's it.